It was a routine traffic stop that changed everything. A black man driving a sleek sedan in a suburban neighborhood is pulled over by a racist cop who has no idea who he's dealing with. Admiral Elijah Thompson, one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Navy, had spent decades battling racism in the military. But in a single moment, he found himself facing the very discrimination he had fought so hard to overcome. What began as a stop for an alleged traffic violation would soon unravel into a shocking encounter, where the cop's blatant prejudice would be exposed, and the consequences of his actions would change everything. This is the story of how one man's integrity, resilience, and strength brought justice to the surface in the most unexpected way. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from, and if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The sun was setting over the quiet streets of the suburban neighborhood. Admiral Elijah Thompson was driving home after a long day. Despite the calm around him, his mind was anything but peaceful. As one of the few black men to rise to the rank of admiral in the U.S. Navy, Elijah had seen more than his share of battles, both on and off the field. Yet the struggles he faced in the Navy were not the ones that weighed on him the most. The battles with racism were the ones that left the deepest scars, and even now, as a decorated officer, those wounds were far from healed. As he drove his sleek, navy blue sedan, a vehicle he had earned after decades of service, Elijah thought about his journey. From humble beginnings in a small southern town, he had defied the odds. His parents had worked tirelessly to support him and his siblings, instilling in him the values of perseverance, hard work, and dignity. But no matter how hard he worked, the specter of racism followed him at every turn. A sudden flash of blue and red lights in his rearview mirror interrupted his thoughts. The familiar sound of a police siren followed shortly after. Elijah frowned, his hands tightening around the steering wheel. He had done nothing wrong, yet here he was, being pulled over. This was not new to him. As a black man, even one of his stature, traffic stops were a routine occurrence, especially in certain neighborhoods. With a deep breath, Elijah pulled over to the side of the road. His calm demeanor didn't reflect the storm of emotions brewing inside him. He had been taught to remain composed in moments like this. In the Navy, maintaining control in the face of adversity was crucial, but this was different. This wasn't a battlefield where the enemy wore a uniform. The enemy here was prejudice, an enemy he had been fighting all his life. The police car pulled up behind him, and a tall officer stepped out. His face was hard, his eyes scanning Elijah's car as if looking for a reason to escalate the situation. Officer Mark Stevens was known around the precinct for his tough approach to law enforcement, particularly in predominantly white neighborhoods. Elijah knew instantly that this stop wasn't about any traffic violation. It was about something deeper, something far more troubling. "License and registration," Officer Stevens barked, standing by the window with a sense of authority that Elijah was all too familiar with. Elijah complied, handing over his documents without a word. He had learned long ago that questioning authority in these situations only made things worse. But that didn't stop the knot in his stomach from tightening. He could feel the officer's eyes on him, scrutinizing his every move, looking for any excuse to escalate the encounter. "You know why I pulled you over?" Stevens asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Elijah shook his head. "No, officer. I wasn't aware of doing anything wrong." Stevens narrowed his eyes, clearly dissatisfied with Elijah's calm response. He wasn't used to people remaining composed under his scrutiny, and something about this man bothered him. Stevens had seen plenty of people like Elijah before, people who didn't belong in this neighborhood, driving cars they couldn't possibly afford. Or at least, that's what he thought. "You made an illegal turn back there," Stevens said, though it was clear even to Elijah that this was an excuse. "Step out of the car." Elijah's pulse quickened, but his military training kept his emotions in check. This was a critical moment. One wrong move, one wrong word, and the situation could spiral out of control. He had seen it happen to others, friends, colleagues, and even family members. But today, it was happening to him. Elijah opened the door and stepped out, his tall frame casting a shadow over the pavement. He raised his hand slightly, a nonverbal signal that he wasn't a threat. But that didn't stop Stevens from placing his hand on his holster. Elijah couldn't help but notice the tension in the officer's stance, the way his fingers twitched as if ready to draw his weapon at any moment. "Turn around," Stevens ordered, his voice now more aggressive. Elijah obeyed, but his mind was racing. He had been in situations far more dangerous than this. He had faced combat, led men into battle, and made decisions that affected the lives of countless soldiers. Yet here he was, being treated like a common criminal simply because of the color of his skin. It was a harsh reminder of the world he lived in, a world where no matter how far he had come, he was still seen as less. Stevens began frisking Elijah, his hands moving roughly across his body. Elijah clenched his jaw, enduring the humiliation with the same discipline that had carried him through years of military service. This wasn't the first time he had been subjected to such treatment, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. But what Stevens didn't know was that the man he was treating like a suspect was one of the highest-ranking officers in the U.S. Navy, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. The officer's search was thorough, but Elijah had nothing to hide. Yet just as Stevens was about to finish, something caught his eye. A badge, tucked neatly into Elijah's wallet, glinted in the dimming light. Stevens froze, his hand hovering over the insignia that marked Elijah's rank. For a moment, the officer seemed unsure of what to do, his previous confidence faltering as he realized the gravity of his actions. But by then, it was too late. The damage had been done. Stevens took a step back, his eyes still glued to the insignia in Elijah's wallet. The wheels in his mind turned slowly, trying to piece together what he was seeing. A black man in a luxury car. He had assumed the worst from the start. But now, as the light from the setting sun caught the polished surface of the Navy insignia, doubt crept into his thoughts. "What's this?" Stevens asked, his voice quieter than before. The authority in his tone had faltered. Elijah glanced at the officer's outstretched hand, where his badge lay exposed. He didn't answer right away, letting the silence stretch between them. It was a familiar feeling, the moment when the weight of his position dawned on someone who had misjudged him. But no matter how many times it happened, the sting of the initial disrespect never dulled. "I'm Admiral Elijah Thompson, U.S. Navy," Elijah said finally, his voice calm but firm. "I serve my country." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Stevens blinked, clearly caught off guard. An admiral, the realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The man he had just frisked, the man he had treated with condescension and suspicion, wasn't just any black man. He was a highly decorated officer, a leader with more influence than Stevens could even begin to comprehend. For a split second, Stevens's face flushed with embarrassment. His eyes darted nervously from the badge to Elijah's steady gaze. But rather than apologize, Stevens did what he had always done in these situations. He doubled down. "Admiral or not, you made an illegal turn," Stevens snapped, his voice hardening once again. He wasn't about to let a moment of doubt undermine his authority. To him, this was about control, and he wasn't ready to lose it. Elijah stood tall, his eyes never leaving the officer. He had encountered men like Stevens before, men who hid their insecurities behind a badge, who saw every interaction with a black man as an opportunity to assert dominance. But Elijah wasn't the kind of man to be intimidated, not anymore. He had faced far greater challenges than this. "I think we both know that's not why you pulled me over," Elijah said, his voice level but filled with quiet strength. Stevens's jaw clenched. He wasn't used to being challenged, especially not by someone he had already pegged as inferior. But there was something about the way Elijah spoke, something about his composure, that made it difficult for Stevens to maintain his usual bravado. Still, he refused to back down. "Watch your tone," Stevens growled, taking a step closer. "I don't care who you are. Out here, I'm in charge." For a moment, the two men stood in silence, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. Elijah could feel the familiar weight of injustice pressing down on him, but he refused to let it break his resolve. He had spent too many years fighting this fight, both in and out of uniform. "You're right, officer," Elijah said finally, his voice steady. "You are in charge here, but that doesn't give you the right to treat me or anyone else like a criminal without cause." Stevens opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, the sound of another car pulling up caught his attention. Both men turned to see a black SUV rolling to a stop behind Stevens's patrol car. The door opened, and a man in civilian clothes stepped out, his eyes immediately locking on the scene unfolding before him. Elijah recognized the man instantly. It was Commander Robert Hall, a longtime colleague and friend from the Navy. Hall had been driving home when he spotted the patrol car and recognized Elijah's vehicle. Sensing something was wrong, he had pulled over to investigate. "Admiral Thompson," Hall called out, striding toward them with a look of concern on his face. "Is everything all right here?" Stevens's eyes widened as the reality of the situation began to sink in. Not only was he dealing with an admiral, but now another high-ranking Navy officer had arrived on the scene. Panic flashed across Stevens's face for the briefest of moments before he quickly composed himself. "This is just a routine traffic stop," Stevens said, though his voice lacked the confidence it had carried earlier. "The Admiral was pulled over for a violation." Commander Hall raised an eyebrow, glancing from Elijah to Stevens, with a look that said he wasn't buying it. He had known Elijah for years, and if there was one thing he was certain of, it was that the Admiral didn't make careless mistakes. Something else was going on here. "Is that right?" Hall asked, his voice cool and professional. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this has gone beyond a routine stop." Stevens shifted uncomfortably, his hand once again hovering near his holster, as if searching for reassurance. But this time he was out of his depth. There were no more excuses, no more ways to explain away his actions. He had misjudged the situation, misjudged Elijah, and now he was beginning to realize just how badly he had messed up. Elijah, sensing the shift in power, remained quiet. He could see the cracks forming in Stevens' facade, but he wasn't interested in humiliating the officer. That wasn't his style. Instead, Elijah waited, allowing Stevens to come to terms with his mistake on his own. After what felt like an eternity, Stevens finally spoke. "Admiral," he said, his voice stiff and formal, "you're free to go." But Elijah didn't move. He stood there, his hands still raised slightly, his expression calm but unwavering. This wasn't just about him. This was about every black man and woman who had been treated unfairly, every person who had been judged based on the color of their skin. Stevens' words were a start, but they weren't enough. "I'll go when you tell me the truth," Elijah said, his voice soft but commanding. "Why did you really pull me over?" Stevens hesitated, his mouth opening and closing as he searched for the right words. But there was no explanation that could undo what had already been done. He had acted on prejudice, and now he was being forced to confront the consequences of his actions. Commander Hall watched the exchange in silence, his eyes flicking back and forth between the two men. He knew this moment was important, not just for Elijah but for Stevens as well. It was a moment of reckoning, a moment that would determine whether the officer was willing to acknowledge the truth or continue hiding behind his badge. For a long moment, the air was thick with silence, weighed down by the gravity of the situation. Stevens shifted on his feet, avoiding eye contact with both Elijah and Commander Hall. The bravado he'd shown earlier had all but disappeared, replaced by something far more uncomfortable: accountability. "I pulled you over because—" Stevens started, his voice faltering as he struggled to find a defensible reason for his actions. His eyes darted around, searching for an excuse that wouldn't sound as hollow as it felt. But deep down, even he knew the truth. He had acted on impulse, on a deeply ingrained bias that had dictated his actions before reason could catch up. "Because I thought you looked suspicious." The words hung in the air like a confession, raw and exposed. Stevens's face flushed as the truth escaped his lips, and the weight of his admission seemed to hang on his shoulders like a burden he hadn't expected to bear. Elijah stood tall, his expression steady but solemn. He had been here before, in situations where he was reduced to a stereotype, where assumptions about his character were made based solely on the color of his skin. This wasn't new to him, but hearing the officer admit it out loud still stung in a way that years of experience hadn't dulled. "Suspicious," Elijah repeated quietly, his gaze never wavering from Stevens. "And what exactly made me suspicious, officer?" Stevens swallowed hard. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. There was nothing he could say that would justify what he had done. No amount of protocol or procedure would make his actions acceptable. And now, standing in the presence of two high-ranking Navy officers, he couldn't hide behind his badge anymore. Commander Hall took a step forward, his eyes sharp as he regarded Stevens. "You're aware that Admiral Thompson has served this country with distinction, aren't you?" Hall's voice was measured, but there was a clear undercurrent of authority in his tone. "He's given his life to protecting the very freedoms you're sworn to uphold." Stevens nodded stiffly, though it was clear the weight of those words hadn't fully sunk in. His earlier assumptions, his prejudice, were being dismantled piece by piece, and he was left grappling with the aftermath. It wasn't just about Elijah's rank or status. It was about the fundamental wrongness of his actions. Elijah's voice cut through the silence once again, calm but filled with quiet power. "You didn't pull me over because of an illegal turn. You didn't stop me because I was a threat. You pulled me over because of what you saw when you looked at me. And that's something you need to face." Stevens' shoulders sagged slightly under the weight of those words. The truth, laid bare in front of him, left no room for argument. He had acted on prejudice, and now he was being called to account for it. For a moment, the officer looked like he wanted to say something in his defense, but no words came. Instead, he took a small step back, as if the realization of what he'd done had finally caught up with him. Commander Hall glanced at Elijah, and for the first time since arriving on the scene, he gave a small nod of understanding. He knew this wasn't just about the traffic stop. It was about something much larger, something that people like Elijah had been dealing with for far too long. "I think we're done here," Elijah said quietly, his voice carrying a note of finality. Officer Stevens, I suggest you take a good look at why you did what you did today. And I hope, for your sake and for others, that you learn from it. Stevens's face was tight with discomfort, but he nodded slowly. There was nothing left for him to say. The cop who had started this encounter full of bravado and confidence was now standing in front of two men who represented everything he hadn't expected: integrity, honor, and the courage to face injustice head-on. Elijah turned back to his car, the tension in his body easing slightly as he prepared to leave. But before he could get in, Commander Hall placed a hand on his shoulder. "Elijah?" Hall said quietly, his voice filled with both respect and concern. "Are you okay?" For the first time since the encounter began, Elijah allowed himself to pause and take a breath. His heart was still racing, and though he had remained calm on the outside, the weight of what had just happened wasn't something he could shake off easily. "I'm fine, Robert," Elijah replied, though the tightness in his voice betrayed the exhaustion he felt. "This isn't new to me. It's just tiring." Hall nodded, his expression softening with understanding. He knew exactly what Elijah meant. Being black in America, even with the rank and status Elijah held, didn't shield him from the kind of prejudice that was so deeply rooted in the fabric of society. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," Hall said firmly, his eyes flashing with anger. "Not after everything you've done for this country." Elijah smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "That's the thing, Robert. No matter what we do, no matter how far we rise, there will always be people who see us as less. People like Stevens." Hall didn't argue. He couldn't. Because as much as he wanted to believe things were changing, the reality of what had just happened was proof that the fight was far from over. "I'll file a report," Hall said after a moment, his tone resolute. "This kind of behavior can't go unchecked." Elijah nodded, though his mind was already moving forward, back to the work he had ahead of him. As an admiral, he had a platform, one that allowed him to push for change in ways that went beyond individual encounters. And if there was one thing he had learned in his years of service, it was that change didn't happen overnight. It required persistence, resilience, and a willingness to stand up, time and time again, against injustice. As he and Hall walked back to their vehicles, Stevens remained where he was, the weight of what had just occurred settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just a routine traffic stop gone wrong. This was a moment of reckoning, one that he would carry with him long after the sun had set on that quiet suburban street. As the engines of both vehicles roared to life, Elijah drove away from the scene, the events replaying in his mind like a movie reel he couldn't stop. The tension of the encounter was still heavy in his chest, but now it mingled with something else, an old familiar ache that came from decades of fighting the same battle over and over again. No matter how far he had come, no matter how much he had achieved, there were always moments like this, moments that reminded him of the barriers that had never fully disappeared. His thoughts wandered back to his time in the Navy, to the countless times he had faced similar discrimination from both superiors and colleagues. Even as an admiral, he had encountered the same prejudices that had followed him throughout his life. It had been subtle at times, dismissive comments, passing glances that conveyed more than words ever could. But it was always there. The idea that, despite his accomplishments, there were those who still saw him through the lens of his race rather than his character or achievements. He remembered his early years as a young officer, full of ambition and hope, eager to prove himself in a world that wasn't designed for men like him to succeed. The military had been a battleground in more ways than one. Not only had he fought for his country, but he had fought for his place within it. He had endured the doubters, the whispers, the subtle slights that told him he didn't belong. And through it all, he had risen, slowly but surely, defying every expectation that had been placed upon him. Yet as the years passed, the fight had taken its toll. He had always been a man of quiet dignity, unwilling to stoop to the level of those who sought to undermine him. But the weight of it, the constant pressure to prove himself, to rise above the racism that had plagued him from the start, had been exhausting. As Elijah continued driving, his thoughts turned to his family. They had been his anchor throughout his career, the source of his strength when the world around him seemed determined to break him down. His wife, Marcia, had been with him since the beginning, standing by his side through every promotion, every transfer, and every battle he had fought, both on and off the field. And his two sons, Malik and Jason, were his greatest source of pride. He had taught them to be strong, to stand tall in the face of adversity, and to never let the world define them by the color of their skin. But even with all the lessons he had passed down, Elijah couldn't protect them from the realities of the world. Both of his sons had faced their own challenges growing up as young black men in America. Malik, the older of the two, had followed in his father's footsteps, joining the Navy straight out of college. But despite his stellar performance, he had quickly learned that the same obstacles his father had faced would follow him as well. Jason, on the other hand, had chosen a different path, pursuing a career in medicine. But even in the world of healthcare, where life and death hung in the balance, he had encountered the same prejudices, the same assumptions about who he was and what he was capable of. Elijah's heart ached for them, knowing that no matter how much he had accomplished, the road ahead would be just as difficult for his sons. He had fought his entire life to pave the way for the next generation, but in moments like this, it felt as though the progress he had made was fragile, easily undone by the actions of men like Officer Stevens. By the time Elijah pulled into the driveway of his home, the sky had darkened into a deep shade of blue, the stars just beginning to flicker in the night sky. He sat in his car for a moment, taking a deep breath to steady himself before heading inside. He didn't want Marcia to worry. She always knew when something was wrong. But tonight, more than anything, he needed to feel the comfort of home, the warmth of his family around him. As he stepped through the front door, the familiar scent of Marcia's cooking filled the air. The soft hum of jazz played in the background, and for a brief moment, Elijah allowed himself to relax. This was his sanctuary, the place where he could let go of the weight he carried every day. "Elijah?" Marcia's voice called from the kitchen. "Is that you?" "Yeah, it's me," Elijah replied, his voice a bit more strained than he intended. He walked into the kitchen, where Marcia stood at the stove, stirring a pot of something that smelled heavenly. She glanced up at him, her sharp eyes immediately noticing the tension in his face. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft but filled with concern. "You look like you've been through the ringer." Elijah hesitated for a moment, not wanting to burden her with the details of the encounter. But he knew better than to hide anything from Marcia. She always knew when something was wrong, and she had been his confidant for years. He sighed and pulled out a chair at the kitchen table, sitting down heavily. "I got pulled over," Elijah said simply, the weight of the words hanging between them. Marcia's hand paused mid-stir, her eyes narrowing. "For what?" "Apparently for an illegal turn," Elijah replied, his voice tinged with sarcasm. "But we both know that's not what it was about." Marcia set the spoon down on the counter, her expression hardening. "Another one of those stops," she muttered, her frustration evident. "How bad was it?" Elijah leaned back in his chair, rubbing a hand over his face. "It was Stevens," he said, and that was all he needed to say. Marcia knew exactly who Officer Stevens was, a cop who had made a name for himself in their town for targeting black drivers. Elijah had heard stories about him from neighbors, and now he had his own story to add to the list. "Did he do anything?" Marcia asked, her voice tight with anger. Elijah shook his head. "Not physically, but he made it clear from the start what this was about. He saw me, saw my car, and made assumptions. You know how it goes." Marcia sat down across from him, her eyes softening as she reached out to take his hand. "I'm sorry, Elijah," she said quietly. "I wish I could say it's getting better, but it's not," Elijah finished for her, his voice resigned. "It feels like no matter how far we come, there's always someone waiting to remind us of where they think we belong." Marcia squeezed his hand gently, her presence a soothing balm to the frustration that still simmered beneath the surface. "But you've made a difference," she reminded him. "You've done more than most men could ever dream of doing, and that matters." Elijah nodded, though the weight of the evening still hung heavily on him. He knew she was right. He had made a difference, both in the Navy and in his community. But there were moments like tonight when the progress seemed fleeting, when the fight felt never-ending. "Let's eat," Marcia said, standing up and walking back to the stove. "You need something warm in your stomach after the day you've had." Elijah smiled faintly, grateful for the comfort of home, of family. As Marcia began to serve dinner, Elijah knew that tomorrow would be another day, another opportunity to keep pushing forward, to keep fighting the battles that needed to be fought. But for now, he was content to be here, in this moment, with the woman who had been his partner through it all. The next morning, Elijah woke up with a clearer head, though the memory of the encounter with Officer Stevens lingered in the back of his mind. As much as he tried to shake it off, it wasn't something that could be easily forgotten. There was work to be done, meetings to attend, and decisions to make, but the weight of the previous night still hung heavy in the air. As Elijah sat at the breakfast table with Marcia, he found himself distracted by thoughts of the Navy. His mind often wandered to the men and women under his command, to the young officers who looked to him for guidance and leadership. He thought about the responsibility he bore, not just as an admiral, but as a black man in a position of authority in an institution that had historically struggled with issues of race. Are you going to report what happened? Marcia asked, pulling him out of his thoughts. Elijah glanced up at her, his brow furrowing slightly. He had considered it, filing a formal complaint about Stevens's behavior, but he wasn't sure what good it would do. He had seen how these things played out before. The officer would face a slap on the wrist, and the underlying problem would remain unchanged. I don't know, Elijah admitted, his voice heavy with uncertainty. It feels like a losing battle sometimes. Marcia set her coffee cup down and leaned forward, her eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. It's not a losing battle, Elijah, she said firmly. Every time you stand up to people like Stevens, you're making a difference. Maybe not right away, maybe not in ways that are immediately visible, but it matters. Elijah sighed, rubbing his temples as he leaned back in his chair. I know it matters. Sometimes I wonder if it's enough. It is, Marcia replied, her voice filled with quiet conviction. You've spent your life breaking down barriers, fighting for change. You can't let one bad cop make you doubt that. Elijah gave her a small, appreciative smile. Marcia always had a way of bringing him back to center, reminding him of the bigger picture. She understood the struggle in a way that few others could. As a black woman, she had faced her own challenges, her own moments of doubt, but she had never given up, and neither could he. Later that day, Elijah found himself in his office, staring out the window at the naval base. The sounds of activity outside were a constant reminder of the work that needed to be done. Ships were being prepared for deployment, officers were being trained, and missions were being planned. It was a world that never stopped moving, and as Admiral, Elijah was at the center of it all. But today his thoughts kept drifting back to his role within the Navy. Specifically, his role as a leader fighting for racial equality within the institution. For years, he had been pushing for changes, for initiatives that would create a more inclusive and just environment for all service members, regardless of their race or background. Some of those initiatives had been successful, but the battle was far from over. Elijah sat down at his desk and pulled out a folder labeled Diversity and Inclusion Initiatives. Inside were documents outlining the programs he had been advocating for, programs designed to address the systemic issues of racism within the Navy. He had worked tirelessly to get these programs off the ground, and while there had been progress, he knew there was still so much more to be done. The phone on his desk rang, pulling him out of his thoughts. Elijah picked it up, his voice steady as he answered. Admiral Thompson, speaking. Admiral, it's Commander Hall, came the familiar voice on the other end of the line. I wanted to follow up on what happened last night. Are you all right? Elijah leaned back in his chair, grateful for the concern in Hall's voice. I'm fine, Robert, he replied, though the truth was a bit more complicated. Just processing everything. I understand, Hall said, his voice sympathetic. I've been thinking about it too. That kind of behavior from Stevens can't be ignored. If we let it slide, it sets a precedent. Elijah nodded, even though Hall couldn't see him. I agree, but filing a formal complaint feels like a temporary fix. Stevens is just one officer. The problem is bigger than him. True, Hall conceded, but taking action against him is a start. It sends a message that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. Elijah thought about that for a moment. Hall was right. While Stevens was just one officer, addressing his actions could be the first step in a larger push for accountability. And if anyone was in a position to make that happen, it was Elijah. You're right, Elijah said finally. I'll file the complaint. Good, Hall replied, relief evident in his voice. I'll back you up all the way, and I think we should talk to the base commander about implementing more training for the local law enforcement. If they're going to be interacting with our officers, they need to understand the importance of respect and equality. Elijah smiled faintly. Hall had always been a good ally, someone who understood the importance of these issues and wasn't afraid to stand up for what was right. I'll bring it up at our next meeting, Elijah said. It's long overdue. After the call ended, Elijah sat back, feeling a sense of resolve settling over him. Filing a complaint against Stevens was just one step in a much larger battle, but it was a step in the right direction. He couldn't afford to let moments like last night go unchallenged, not just for himself, but for the men and women under his command, and for the future of the Navy as a whole. As the day wore on, Elijah met with several of his staff members, reviewing reports and discussing upcoming deployments. But even as he focused on the tasks at hand, the conversation with Hall lingered in the back of his mind. It was time to do more, to push harder for the changes that were so desperately needed. By the time the sun began to set again, Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose. He had faced discrimination head-on, and while it was exhausting, it wasn't something he could allow to defeat him. Not when there was so much at stake. That night, as he sat at the dinner table with Marcia once again, Elijah shared his decision with her. "I'm filing a complaint against Stevens," he said, watching her reaction carefully. Marcia nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Good," she said softly. "I knew you would." Elijah smiled back, the warmth of her support giving him the strength he needed to keep going. The road ahead was long, but with Marcia by his side and the knowledge that he was fighting for something bigger than himself, Elijah knew he could face whatever came next. The following week passed in a blur of meetings, paperwork, and mission planning. Elijah had been so busy that the events with Officer Stevens had almost faded into the background. But the complaint had been filed, and the gears of accountability were beginning to turn. Commander Hall had kept him updated on the status of the investigation, and it seemed that Stevens' actions were under scrutiny from both the local precinct and the Navy's leadership. But as the days passed, Elijah couldn't help but think about the broader implications of what had happened. It wasn't just about Stevens. It wasn't just about one officer's poor judgment. It was about the system that allowed these encounters to happen in the first place. And as much as Elijah had tried to distance himself from it, and the truth was that racism and prejudice were still deeply rooted in both the military and civilian institutions he was a part of. One afternoon, Elijah found himself standing in front of a room full of young officers, delivering a lecture on leadership and resilience. As he spoke, he looked out at their faces, and for a moment, he was struck by how much the Navy had changed since he had first joined. There were more women, more people of color, more diversity in the ranks than ever before. But even with all that progress, there were still challenges. Challenges that Elijah knew these young officers would have to face in the years to come. "You will be tested," Elijah told them, his voice steady but firm. "Not just in battle, but in life. As leaders, it is your responsibility to uphold the values of this institution. Honor, courage, and commitment. But more than that, you must be prepared to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard, even when it feels like you're standing alone." The room was silent as the young officers listened intently, their eyes fixed on Elijah. He could see the weight of his words settling over them, and for a moment he allowed himself to hope that they would take this lesson to heart, that they would be the ones to continue the fight for equality and justice, both within the Navy and beyond. After the lecture, several of the officers approached him, asking questions and seeking advice. Elijah spent the next hour speaking with them, sharing his experiences and offering guidance. But even as he did, his mind kept drifting back to the larger issues at play. How could he, as a leader, do more to address the systemic racism that still plagued the Navy? What more could be done to ensure that every service member, regardless of their race or background, was treated with the respect and dignity they deserved? Later that evening, Elijah met with Commander Hall once again. The two men sat in Elijah's office, discussing the progress of the investigation into Stevens' conduct. Hall was optimistic that the complaint would lead to meaningful consequences, but Elijah remained cautious. He had seen too many situations like this end with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. "We need to do more than just react to incidents like this," Elijah said, his voice firm. "Guys, we need to be proactive. We need to create an environment where this kind of behavior isn't just punished, it's prevented." Hall nodded, leaning forward in his chair. "I agree, but how do we get there? We've made strides, but it still feels like we're fighting the same battles over and over again." Elijah leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window as he considered the question. "It starts with leadership," he said after a moment. "We need to set the tone from the top down. We need to make it clear that racism, prejudice, and discrimination have no place in the Navy, or anywhere else for that matter. And we need to hold people accountable when they cross the line." Hall nodded again, but Elijah could see the same frustration he felt mirrored in his colleagues' eyes. It wasn't that they didn't know what needed to be done. It was the sheer magnitude of the task that felt overwhelming at times. The system was slow to change, and while progress had been made, there were still so many barriers to overcome. "Maybe we should think about expanding the diversity and inclusion programs," Hall suggested after a moment. "We could focus more on educating people, not just on what's unacceptable, but on why it's unacceptable. There's a lot of ignorance out there, and part of our job is to address that." Elijah nodded thoughtfully. "That's a good idea. We can't just assume that everyone understands the impact of their actions. We need to make it clear, and we need to provide the tools and resources for people to learn." The conversation continued late into the evening, with Elijah and Hall brainstorming ways to improve the Navy's approach to diversity and inclusion. It was a daunting task, but Elijah felt a renewed sense of purpose as they discussed the possibilities. This was the work that needed to be done, the work that would make a lasting difference. By the time the meeting ended, Elijah was exhausted but hopeful. He knew the road ahead was long, but he was committed to seeing it through. As he walked to his car, the cool night air cleared his mind, and he found himself thinking once again about the young officers he had spoken to earlier that day. They were the future of the Navy, and it was up to him, and leaders like him, to ensure that they were equipped to face the challenges ahead. As he drove home, Elijah's thoughts returned to Officer Stevens. The investigation was ongoing, but Elijah had no doubt that justice would be served. Stevens would face the consequences of his actions, but more importantly, the incident would serve as a catalyst for change. Elijah was determined to use this moment as an opportunity to push for the reforms that were so desperately needed. When Elijah arrived home, Marcia was waiting for him, as she always was. She greeted him with a warm smile, and for a moment the weight of the day lifted from his shoulders. They sat down for dinner, and Elijah shared the details of his meeting with Hall. "I'm proud of you," Marcia said, her voice soft but sincere. "You're making a difference, Elijah. Even if it doesn't always feel like it, you are." Elijah smiled, though the exhaustion in his eyes was still evident. "I hope so," he replied. "Sometimes it feels like an uphill battle, but I can't stop now. There's too much at stake." Marcia reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "You've come this far, Elijah. You've already changed so much, and I know you'll keep pushing, no matter what." Elijah squeezed her hand gently, grateful for her unwavering support. "I will," he said quietly, "for as long as I'm able." The days that followed were a whirlwind of meetings, strategy sessions, and quiet moments of reflection. Elijah, ever the stoic leader, immersed himself in the work that had always defined his life. But even as he focused on his duties as Admiral, the issue of Officer Stevens lingered in his mind. He knew that the complaint he had filed was making its way through the proper channels, but the weight of what had happened still pressed heavily on his shoulders. One afternoon, Elijah received a call from Captain Jane Williams, a colleague he had worked with closely on several initiatives to promote diversity within the Navy. Jane, like Elijah, was passionate about the need for reform, and she had always been a strong ally in the fight for equality. "Admiral," Jane's voice came through the phone with a tone of urgency. "I wanted to update you on the situation with Officer Stevens." Elijah's posture straightened slightly, his mind instantly shifting to the events of that night. "Go ahead, Captain," he replied, bracing himself for whatever news she was about to deliver. "The investigation into Stevens's conduct is moving forward," Jane explained. "There's been a lot of pressure from both the Navy and the local precinct to address what happened. Stevens is being placed on administrative leave, pending the outcome of the inquiry." Elijah felt a small sense of satisfaction at the news. It wasn't justice in its entirety, but it was a start. Stevens being held accountable, even in the early stages, was a sign that this wasn't going to be swept under the rug. "That's good to hear," Elijah said, his voice steady. "But what about the bigger picture? Have we made any progress on the training and reform initiatives we discussed?" Jane hesitated for a moment before responding. "It's slow, Admiral. The leadership is open to the idea, but you know how these things go. Change doesn't happen overnight." Elijah exhaled, his patience thinning slightly, but he understood all too well the inertia that often accompanied efforts to push for systemic change. "We can't afford to move slowly on this, Jane," he said firmly. "This isn't just about one incident. It's about ensuring that incidents like this don't keep happening." "I know," Jane replied, her voice filled with sympathy. "And I'm with you. We'll keep pushing. We've already started drafting a proposal for a new set of diversity and inclusion training programs for the Muslim law enforcement. We're also looking into expanding the mentorship program for junior officers, particularly those from underrepresented backgrounds." Elijah nodded, even though Jane couldn't see him. "That's a good start," he said. "But we need more than training. We need accountability. We need to make it clear that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated. Not from law enforcement, not from military personnel, not from anyone." Jane agreed, and the conversation continued as they discussed the specifics of the proposed reforms. Elijah felt a renewed sense of determination as they laid out their plans. This was the work that mattered. The fight for equality, for justice. It wasn't just about dealing with the aftermath of incidents like the one with Stevens. It was about creating a culture where those incidents didn't happen in the first place. After the call ended, Elijah sat back in his chair, his mind racing with ideas. He had been working on these issues for years, but the events of the past few weeks had given him a new sense of urgency. The time for incremental change was over. It was time to push harder, to demand more, to hold people accountable in ways that would lead to real, lasting change. That evening, Elijah met with a group of senior officers to discuss the future of the Navy's diversity and inclusion programs. The room was filled with high-ranking officials, some of whom had been in the Navy as long as Elijah had. As he looked around the table, he could see that the mood was serious, but there was also a sense of anticipation. Everyone knew that change was coming. It was just a matter of how fast it would arrive. "Let's be clear," Elijah began, his voice commanding the attention of the room. "We've made progress in recent years, but we still have a long way to go. The events of the past few weeks have shown us that there are still deep-rooted issues that need to be addressed, both within the Navy and in the way we interact with the communities around us." The officers around the table nodded in agreement, but Elijah could sense the hesitation from some of them. Change was never easy, especially in an institution as old and rigid as the Navy. But Elijah wasn't interested in taking the easy path. "We need to be proactive," he continued. "We can't just react to incidents like the one with Officer Stevens. We need to be ahead of the curve. We need to create a culture where racism and discrimination are not only discouraged, but actively stamped out." There was a murmur of agreement from the room, but one officer, Admiral Jonathan Parker, spoke up, his tone cautious. "Admiral Thompson, I agree with you in principle, but we need to be careful. There are a lot of moving parts here, and we can't afford to rush into anything without thinking it through." Elijah nodded, understanding Parker's concerns, but he also knew that hesitation was the enemy of progress. "I hear you, Jonathan," he said, "but we've been thinking things through for too long. It's time to act. We need to send a message loud and clear that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated. And we need to back that message up with real action. Policies, training, and accountability measures that will ensure that everyone, regardless of their background, is treated with the respect they deserve." Parker remained quiet, but Elijah could see that the other officers in the room were on board. The discussion continued for over an hour, with Elijah and the other senior officers laying out the specifics of the proposed reforms. By the end of the meeting, there was a clear plan in place, one that would be presented to Navy leadership in the coming weeks. As the meeting adjourned, Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment. It wasn't a victory yet, but it was progress. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but they were moving in the right direction. That night, as Elijah sat in his home office, reviewing the notes from the meeting, he felt a small glimmer of hope. Change was never easy, but he had always believed that it was possible. And now, more than ever, he was determined to see it through. The momentum for change within the Navy was building. Over the next few weeks, Elijah found himself at the center of conversations that went far beyond the incident with Officer Stevens. The complaint he had filed had brought long-standing issues to the surface, and now there was no going back. People were paying attention. The media had caught wind of the story, and while Elijah had done his best to avoid drawing too much personal attention, the incident had sparked a larger conversation about race, leadership, and accountability. Reporters from both military and civilian outlets were asking questions, wanting to know what actions the Navy was taking to address these issues. Elijah's focus remained on the work, on the programs he had spent years advocating for, on the officers under his command, and on the institution he loved, even with its flaws. But the spotlight was an inescapable reality now, and he knew that how he handled this moment would set the tone for what came next. One afternoon, Elijah was called into a meeting with Admiral Peter Richardson, the Chief of Naval Operations. Richardson was a powerful figure within the Navy, a man who had the authority to enact the kind of reforms Elijah had been pushing for. But Richardson was also known for his pragmatism, for his cautious approach to change. As Elijah entered Richardson's office, he was greeted with a firm handshake and a gesture to sit. The office was large with a view overlooking the naval base. Richardson sat behind an imposing desk, his expression serious but not unkind. "Admiral Thompson," Richardson began, his voice calm but authoritative, "I've been following the situation with Officer Stevens closely, and I've also reviewed your proposals for the diversity and inclusion reforms." Elijah nodded, his expression composed as he waited for Richardson to continue. "I want you to know that I support your efforts," Richardson said. "The Navy has made progress, but I agree with you. We still have a long way to go. That being said, we need to be strategic about how we move forward. We can't afford to make hasty decisions." Elijah had expected this approach. Richardson was a leader who valued stability, and while he wasn't opposed to change, he preferred to implement it gradually. But Elijah knew that the time for gradual change had passed. "With all due respect, Admiral," Elijah replied, his tone respectful but firm, "we've been moving slowly for too long. The issues we're facing aren't new, and while I understand the need for caution, we can't afford to wait any longer. The Navy needs to send a clear message that racism and discrimination won't be tolerated. Not now, not ever." Richardson studied Elijah for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered the younger admiral's words. And what would you propose? And he asked. What's the next step? Elijah leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. We need to implement mandatory diversity and inclusion training for all officers and enlisted personnel, with a focus on understanding the impact of implicit bias and systemic racism. We also need to expand the mentorship programs for underrepresented service members, and we need to hold people accountable when they violate the values of this institution. Richardson nodded slowly, taking in Elijah's words. I agree with you in principle, Admiral, he said after a moment, but we also need to be realistic. These changes won't happen overnight, and we need to be prepared for pushback, from within the ranks and from external forces. Elijah knew Richardson was right about the pushback. There were always those who resisted change, especially when it threatened to upend the status quo. But Elijah also knew that without bold action, the Navy would continue to face the same issues, over and over again. I understand the challenges, sir, Elijah said, but we can't let fear of pushback stop us from doing what's right. If we wait for the perfect moment, it will never come. We have an opportunity now to lead by example, to show the world that the Navy is committed to justice and equality, not just in words, but in action. Richardson leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window for a moment before returning to Elijah. You're a determined man, Admiral Thompson, he said, a small smile playing at the corner of his lips. That's why you've made it this far. Elijah returned the smile, though his expression remained serious. I didn't get this far by accepting things as they are, sir, he said. I got here by challenging the status quo, by believing that we could be better. There was a long pause as Richardson considered Elijah's words. Finally, he nodded. All right, he said. We'll move forward with the training programs. I'll sign off on expanding the mentorship initiative as well. But I want you to be prepared for the resistance we're going to face. Change at this level is never easy, and not everyone will be on board. I'm prepared, Elijah replied, his voice steady. And I believe the Navy is ready for this. We owe it to the men and women who serve to make this institution a place where everyone is treated with respect and dignity. With that, the meeting concluded, and Elijah left Richardson's office feeling a renewed sense of purpose. The conversation had gone better than he had expected, but he knew that the real work was only just beginning. As Elijah walked back to his office, his phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from Commander Hall. We've made progress. Stevens is being formally charged. Details to follow. Elijah paused, the message sinking in. Formal charges. It was a significant development, and while it wouldn't undo what had happened, it was a step toward justice. Stevens would face the consequences of his actions, and Elijah hoped that this would be the first of many such moments of accountability within the system. Later that evening, as Elijah sat with Marcia, he told her about the day's developments. She listened intently, her eyes filled with the quiet strength that had always defined her. You're making a difference, Elijah, Marcia said softly, her hand resting on his. People are paying attention, and things are starting to change. Elijah smiled at her, the weight of the day lifting slightly as he sat beside her. I hope so, he said. I just want to make sure that the changes we're making are real, lasting. They will be, Marcia replied, because you won't stop until they are. Elijah nodded, knowing that she was right. The fight for justice was long and often exhausting, but it was a fight worth having. And as long as he was in a position to push for change, he would keep pushing. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity. The Navy's leadership had officially announced the new diversity and inclusion training programs, and Elijah was at the forefront of the initiative. Alongside Commander Hall and Captain Williams, he began working on the curriculum, ensuring that it didn't just tick boxes, but actually addressed the deep-seated issues of bias and racism. Elijah had long believed that education was one of the most powerful tools in the fight against prejudice. He had seen time and time again how ignorance fueled fear and discrimination. Now, with the full weight of the Navy behind this initiative, he had the chance to do more than just react to the incidents that had plagued the institution for years. He could help prevent them from happening in the first place. The media had continued to cover the case of Officer Stevens, but Elijah had made it a point to stay out of the spotlight as much as possible. This wasn't about him. It was about the larger fight for justice and equality. Still, the case had sparked a national conversation, and Elijah couldn't ignore the fact that his name had become synonymous with the push for reform within the Navy. One afternoon, Elijah sat in his office, going over the final drafts of the training program. The modules covered everything from the history of systemic racism in the United States to the impact of implicit bias on decision-making. There were case studies, interactive discussions, and practical scenarios designed to challenge officers and enlisted personnel to confront their own biases. As he reviewed the documents, Elijah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride in what they had accomplished. This was the kind of work that could make a real difference, the kind of work that would outlast his career and continue to shape the Navy for generations to come. Just as Elijah was about to wrap up for the day, his phone buzzed. It was a message from Commander Hall. "Stevens is being arraigned tomorrow. I thought you'd want to know." Elijah stared at the message for a moment, letting the news sink in. Stevens' arraignment was the next step in the legal process. And while it was a formality, it still represented a significant moment in the case. For Elijah, it was a reminder that the wheels of justice, though slow, were still turning. The next day, Elijah found himself standing outside the courthouse, watching as reporters and photographers crowded the entrance. He had chosen not to attend the arraignment itself. He didn't want to make the case about him, but he knew that his presence was a reminder of why this moment mattered. As Stevens was led into the courthouse, handcuffed and surrounded by officers, Elijah felt a complicated mix of emotions. On one hand, there was satisfaction in knowing that the man who had wronged him was facing the consequences of his actions. But on the other hand, Elijah knew that Stevens was just one man, a symptom of a much larger problem. This case, while important, wouldn't solve everything. There was still so much work to be done. Later that evening, Elijah received a call from Captain Williams. "Admiral, I thought you'd want to hear it from me," she said, her voice calm but serious. "The arraignment went as expected. Stevens is officially facing charges of misconduct and racial discrimination. It's a solid case." "Good," Elijah replied, his tone steady. "That's a step in the right direction." "It is," Williams agreed, "but I know this isn't the end of the road." Elijah nodded, even though Williams couldn't see him. "No, it's not, but it's progress, and we'll take it one step at a time." The two continued to talk for a while, discussing the ongoing initiatives within the Navy and the upcoming implementation of the training programs. Williams had always been one of Elijah's strongest allies, and he trusted her judgment when it came to navigating the challenges they were facing. After the call ended, Elijah sat back in his chair, reflecting on everything that had transpired over the past few months. The case with Stevens, the push for reform, the conversations with Navy leadership. It had all felt like a marathon. And while there was still a long way to go, Elijah was proud of the strides they had made. As the evening stretched on, Elijah found himself thinking about his family, about Marcia, who had been his rock throughout this entire ordeal, and about his sons, Malik and Jason. He thought about the future they would inherit and the kind of world he wanted to leave behind for them. That night, as he sat at the dinner table with Marcia, Elijah shared the latest developments in the case. She listened quietly, nodding as he spoke, her expression thoughtful. "I'm glad justice is being served," Marcia said after a moment, her voice soft but resolute. "But I know this isn't just about Stevens for you." Elijah smiled faintly, appreciating how well she understood him. "It's not," he admitted. "Stevens is just one piece of the puzzle. The real fight is making sure this kind of thing doesn't keep happening, making sure that the system changes, not just individual people." Marcia reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "You've already done so much, Elijah, and you're not done yet." Elijah nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. He had come a long way, but he knew there was still more to do. The fight for justice and equality wasn't over. Not for him, not for the Navy, and not for the country. But as long as he had breath in his body, he would keep pushing, keep fighting, keep making sure that the next generation wouldn't have to face the same battles he had. As the weeks went by, the case against Officer Stevens moved through the legal system. Elijah had kept his distance from the courtroom, choosing instead to focus on his work and the reforms he was helping to push through the Navy. The arraignment had brought Stevens's actions into the public eye, and it was clear that the community and the nation was watching closely. Meanwhile, within the Navy, the diversity and inclusion training program Elijah had spearheaded was beginning to take shape. The first rounds of training had been scheduled, and the program was already being praised for its thoroughness and its commitment to real, lasting change. It wasn't just about awareness anymore. It was about action. One afternoon, Elijah received a visit from Captain Williams. She entered his office with a stack of papers and a determined look on her face. "Admiral, I've got the final approval for the training program," she said, handing him the documents. "It's all set. We're starting the first round of sessions next week." Elijah took the papers and scanned them briefly, nodding as he read. "This is good," he said, setting the documents aside. "This is what we need." Williams sat down across from him, her expression thoughtful. "It's a start," she agreed. "But I've been thinking, this program is great, but we need to make sure it's not just a one-time thing. We need to follow up, evaluate its effectiveness, and adapt it as we go." Elijah leaned back in his chair, considering her words. You're right. We can't just implement this and assume it'll solve everything. We need to keep pushing, keep refining, and make sure that the message sticks. Williams nodded, and the two of them spent the next hour discussing the long-term strategy for the program. They talked about ways to measure success, about the feedback they would gather from participants, and about how to ensure that the training was more than just a box-ticking exercise. Elijah knew that real change required continuous effort, and he was determined to see this initiative through. As the meeting came to an end, Williams stood up and smiled. "I have to say, Admiral," she said, "it's been an honor working on this with you. You're making a real difference." Elijah smiled back, though the weight of responsibility still sat heavily on his shoulders. "We're all making a difference," he said. "This is bigger than any one of us." That evening, as Elijah walked through the naval base, he couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought him here. The fight for equality, for justice, had been a long one that had started long before his encounter with Officer Stevens. It was a fight that had defined his career, and even as he neared the twilight of his service, Elijah knew that his work was far from over. As he made his way to his car, Elijah noticed a familiar figure standing by the entrance of the base, a young officer he had mentored, Lieutenant Marcus Davis. Marcus had come to Elijah years ago, fresh out of the Naval Academy, full of ambition but also full of doubts about his place in an institution that had not always been welcoming to people like him. Elijah had taken him under his wing, guiding him through the challenges and helping him find his footing as a black man in the Navy. "Lieutenant Davis," Elijah called out as he approached. Marcus turned and smiled. "Admiral Thompson, good to see you, sir," he said, saluting. Elijah returned the salute, then clasped Marcus on the shoulder. "How are things going, Lieutenant?" "Good, sir," Marcus replied. "I've been hearing about the new diversity training programs. It's really exciting. A lot of us have been talking about it, and it feels like, I don't know, like things are starting to change." Elijah smiled at the optimism in Marcus's voice. "That's the goal," he said. "But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's up to all of us to keep pushing, to make sure that the progress we're making is real and lasting." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I know, sir, and I'm ready. I want to do my part." Elijah felt a swell of pride as he looked at Marcus. This was why he had fought so hard, so that young officers like Marcus wouldn't have to face the same struggles he had. The Navy was changing, slowly but surely, and Elijah knew that leaders like Marcus would carry the torch forward. "Good," Elijah said. "Keep that fire. You're going to make a difference." With that, Elijah bid Marcus farewell and headed home. As he drove through the quiet streets, his thoughts drifted once again to the larger battle he was fighting. The Navy was just one institution, and while he was proud of the progress they were making, Elijah knew that the fight for justice extended far beyond its walls. When he arrived home, Marcia greeted him at the door with a smile, and Elijah felt the tension of the day begin to ease. They sat down for dinner, and as they talked, Elijah shared the details of his meeting with Williams and the conversation he'd had with Marcus. "I'm proud of you," Marcia said softly, her hand resting on his. "You've done so much, Elijah. You've given everything to this fight, and it's paying off." Elijah smiled, though there was a touch of weariness in his eyes. "I just hope it's enough," he said quietly. "There's still so much to be done." "It's never going to be easy," Marcia replied, "but you've set things in motion. You've paved the way for others to follow, and that's something to be proud of." Elijah nodded, knowing she was right. He had done everything in his power to make a difference, to fight for equality, to push for change. And while the work wasn't finished, he took comfort in knowing that he had played a part in shaping a better future. As the evening wore on, Elijah sat on the porch, looking out at the stars. The fight for justice, for equality, was far from over. But as long as he had the strength to keep going, he would continue to push forward, to stand up for what was right. And with leaders like Marcus Davis rising through the ranks, Elijah knew that the future was in good hands. The momentum for change in the Navy was undeniable. But as with any significant shift, it didn't come without its share of challenges. As Elijah continued pushing for deeper reforms, he began to notice a growing resistance, not from those in direct command, but from within the ranks. There were murmurs, whispers among some of the more traditional officers, those who believed that the Navy's way of doing things had worked for centuries and didn't need to be altered. Elijah wasn't surprised. He had seen it before, especially early in his career when he advocated for policies that supported minority officers. But he also knew that resistance was often the clearest sign that change was happening. One afternoon, as Elijah sat reviewing the latest feedback from the Diversity and Inclusion Program's first sessions, his assistant knocked on the door. Admiral, there's someone here to see you, the young officer said, his expression a bit uncertain. He didn't have an appointment, but he says it's important. Elijah raised an eyebrow, curious about the unexpected visitor. Send him in. The door opened, and in walked Commander Mitchell Evans, a senior officer with whom Elijah had crossed paths many times over the years. Evans had a reputation for being a stickler for tradition, a man who believed in hierarchy and the old ways of doing things. As he entered the room, his expression was unreadable, but Elijah could sense there was something on his mind. Commander Evans, Elijah greeted him, gesturing to the chair in front of his desk. What brings you here today? Evans sat down, his posture rigid, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Admiral, he began, his voice steady but tense. I've been hearing a lot about the new diversity training programs. I understand the intent behind them, but I've got to be honest, I'm not sure they're necessary. Elijah leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze never leaving Evans. He had expected this conversation eventually, but now that it was happening, he was determined to handle it with the patience and respect it required. Why do you feel that way, Commander? Elijah asked, keeping his tone calm. Evans hesitated, choosing his words carefully. It's not that I'm against inclusion or fairness, he said slowly, but the Navy's always been about merit, about rising through the ranks based on your ability, not your background. I just worry that focusing too much on things like race and identity might undermine that. Elijah nodded, understanding where Evans was coming from, but also knowing that this mindset was exactly what needed to be challenged. I hear you, Commander, Elijah said, and I agree, merit is critical. But what we have seen, time and time again, is that merit doesn't exist in a vacuum. When systemic biases are in place, even the most talented people can be held back. Not because they aren't capable, but because the system wasn't built to give them the same opportunities. Evans looked down at his hands for a moment, then back at Elijah. I guess I've just never thought about it that way, he admitted. I've always believed that if you worked hard enough, you'd get where you wanted to go. And for some people, that's true, Elijah replied. But for others, especially those from marginalized backgrounds, the path is a lot steeper. The training programs aren't about lowering standards. They're about ensuring that everyone has a fair shot at success, based on their merit, not on factors they can't control. Evans remained quiet, absorbing Elijah's words. After a long pause, he nodded slowly. I can see your point, Admiral. Maybe I've been a bit too set in my ways. Elijah smiled faintly. It's not easy to see things from a different perspective, especially when you've been part of a system that's worked well for you. But change doesn't mean abandoning what's worked. It means improving it, making sure it works for everyone. Evans stood up, extending his hand. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me, sir. I'll do my best to keep an open mind about all of this. Elijah shook his hand firmly. That's all I ask, Commander. We're all in this together, trying to make the Navy the best it can be. As Evans left the office, Elijah sat back in his chair, reflecting on the conversation. It wasn't the first time he'd had to explain the importance of diversity and inclusion, and it certainly wouldn't be the last, but he was heartened by the fact that even those who had resisted change were starting to come around. Later that evening, as Elijah sat down to dinner with Marcia, he recounted the conversation with Evans. It's encouraging to see that some people are willing to listen, Elijah said, his tone thoughtful. But there's still a lot of resistance out there. I'm not sure how we're going to get through to everyone. Marcia smiled softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. You're not going to get through to everyone, Elijah. And that's okay. The important thing is that you're getting through to some, and that's how change starts. One conversation, one person at a time. Elijah nodded, knowing she was right. He had spent his career fighting for change, and while it was frustrating to see how slow progress could be, he also knew that every small victory mattered. People like Evans weren't going to transform overnight, but the fact that he had been willing to listen, that he had left the office with a new perspective, was proof that the fight was worth it. As the night wore on, Elijah found himself thinking about the future of the Navy. He thought about the young officers, like Lieutenant Marcus Davis, who were coming up in an institution that was slowly becoming more inclusive, more just. He thought about the progress they were making with the training programs, and about the new policies that were being put into place to ensure accountability and fairness. There was still work to be done. There always would be. But as Elijah sat on his porch that night, watching the stars twinkle in the sky, he felt a sense of peace. The road ahead was long, but they were on the right path. And as long as he had the strength to keep pushing, he knew that real, lasting change was within reach. The momentum that Elijah had worked so hard to build was finally translating into action. The Navy's diversity and inclusion programs were being rolled out across multiple bases, and early feedback from officers and enlisted personnel was encouraging. While not everyone embraced the changes immediately, the conversations they sparked were opening doors that had long been closed. But as the Navy took these first steps toward real reform, Elijah knew that the challenges were far from over. There were still many who believed that the institution's traditions were under attack, and rumors of discontent began to circulate among some of the more conservative ranks. Elijah was no stranger to resistance, but he also understood the delicate balance that had to be maintained, pushing for change while keeping the organization united in its mission. One morning, Elijah received a call from Admiral Richardson. The conversation was brief, but its impact stayed with him long after the call ended. "Elijah," Richardson had said, "I need you to know that the higher-ups are watching everything very closely. The changes you've implemented are being discussed at the highest levels of command. Some are in favor, but others are questioning whether we're moving too quickly. There's pressure to pull back. I need you to be prepared for that." Elijah had expected as much. Pushing for reform in an institution as large and historic as the Navy was never going to be easy. But hearing it directly from Richardson reminded him that the fight was far from over. There would be setbacks, there always were. But Elijah was determined not to let fear of resistance slow him down. Later that day, Elijah found himself in a meeting with several senior officers, discussing the latest developments in the case against Officer Stevens. The investigation had concluded, and Stevens was facing both legal and disciplinary action for his misconduct. It was a small victory, but one that sent a clear message. One Elijah hoped would resonate far beyond this single case. As the meeting drew to a close, one of the officers, Captain Sarah Powell, raised an important point. "Admiral Thompson," she began, her voice steady, "while I'm glad to see that justice is being served in the case of Officer Stevens, I think it's important that we don't let this be a one-off. There are plenty of other cases out there, not just in law enforcement, but within our own ranks, where bias and discrimination have gone unchecked." Elijah nodded, appreciating Powell's directness. "You're absolutely right, Captain," he said. "Stevens is just one example of a much larger problem. We need to be vigilant in rooting out this kind of behavior, whether it's in the police force or within our own command structure." Powell leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "What's the plan moving forward? How do we ensure that this isn't just a reaction to one incident, but part of a larger, ongoing effort to address systemic issues?" Elijah considered her question carefully before responding. "We need to institutionalize the reforms we've started," he said. "The diversity training programs are a good first step, but they need to be reinforced with real accountability. That means regular reviews, audits of our policies, and creating a culture where people feel comfortable speaking up when they see something wrong." The other officers in the room nodded in agreement, and the conversation shifted to the specifics of how these reforms would be implemented over the long term. As Elijah listened to the ideas being shared, he felt a renewed sense of hope. The Navy had a long way to go, but it was clear that there were people within the institution who were committed to making it better. After the meeting, Elijah stepped outside into the warm afternoon sun. He had a brief moment of peace as he walked across the base, feeling the familiar hum of activity around him. Ships were being prepared for deployment, officers were running drills, and the day-to-day operations of the Navy continued as they always had. But as Elijah walked, he couldn't help but reflect on the deeper changes that were taking place. These weren't just surface-level reforms. This was about shifting the culture of an institution that had, for so long, resisted change. It was about creating an environment where every service member, regardless of their background, could thrive. Later that evening, Elijah sat down with Marcia, as he often did, to share the details of his day. As he spoke about the progress they were making, Marcia listened intently, her eyes filled with the quiet understanding that had always been her greatest gift. "You're doing incredible work," she said softly when he finished, "but I can tell it's weighing on you." Elijah smiled faintly, knowing she could always see through the stoic exterior he put on for the world. "It's just a lot," he admitted. "There are days when I feel like we're making progress, and then there are days when it feels like we're hitting a wall." Marcia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's how change works, though, isn't it? 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's never a straight path." Elijah sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I know. I just don't want to lose momentum. There are so many people counting on this, counting on us to get it right." "And you will," Marcia said firmly. "You've already started something that can't be undone. Even if there's resistance, even if it takes time, the change is happening." Elijah reached across the table, palm, taking her hand in his. "I couldn't do this without you, you know." Marcia smiled warmly. "You don't have to do it alone. You've got a whole team behind you. People who believe in what you're doing. And more importantly, you've got the strength to see this through." Elijah squeezed her hand gently, feeling the weight of her words settle over him like a blanket of reassurance. She was right. He wasn't alone in this fight. And while there would always be obstacles, he had come too far to turn back now. The night was quiet as Elijah sat on the porch, watching the stars blink softly in the sky. In the stillness, he found a sense of peace, knowing that the work he was doing, no matter how difficult, was worth it. He thought about the young officers coming up through the ranks, like Marcus Davis, and the many others who would benefit from the changes being made. He thought about the legacy he was building, not just for himself, but for the Navy as a whole. As the cool night air washed over him, Elijah made a promise to himself. No matter what challenges lay ahead, he would continue to fight for the Navy he believed in, a Navy that was just, inclusive, and worthy of the men and women who served in it. As the weeks went by, the Navy's diversity and inclusion training programs continued to roll out across bases nationwide. Feedback from the participants showed that the sessions were opening up conversations that many had never thought to have. Officers and enlisted personnel were confronting their own biases, reflecting on how institutional racism had shaped their experiences, and realizing that the path to true equality was far from complete. Elijah kept a close eye on the progress, and although the pushback from certain quarters of the Navy persisted, the overall reception was promising. He knew that there would always be some resistance. Change was never welcomed by everyone, but as he saw the growing momentum behind the reforms, he felt a cautious sense of optimism. One day, while Elijah was reviewing the latest reports on the program's success, he received a call from Commander Hall. "Admiral?" Hall's voice was firm but carried an edge of excitement. "I've just received news. Stevens has accepted a plea deal. He's agreed to plead guilty to misconduct and racial discrimination. In exchange, they're offering a reduced sentence." Elijah sat back in his chair, processing the news. The case against Stevens had been a long, drawn-out process. And while a guilty plea wasn't the same as a full trial, it was still a victory. Stevens would be held accountable, and his actions wouldn't go unpunished. "That's good news," Elijah said slowly, still thinking through the implications. "It's not perfect, but it's a step toward justice." Hall agreed. "It's more than many thought we'd get, considering how these cases tend to go. But more importantly, it sets a precedent. This case has become a rallying cry for reforms, and Stevens pleading guilty only strengthens the argument that we need to continue pushing for change." Elijah nodded, knowing that Hall was right. This case had highlighted the deep-seated issues within the system, and while Stevens's guilty plea wouldn't solve everything, it sent a clear message that people would be held accountable for their actions. After the call ended, Elijah found himself reflecting on the journey that had led him to this point. The encounter with Officer Stevens had been just one chapter in a much larger story, a story that stretched back to his earliest days in the Navy, when he had first encountered the systemic racism that still lingered in the institution. But this moment, with Stevens finally facing the consequences of his actions, felt like a turning point. Later that afternoon, Elijah was approached by a group of junior officers who had recently completed the diversity training program. They stood outside his office, eager to speak with him about their experience. Admiral Thompson, one of the officers, a young man named Lieutenant James, began, "We just finished the training program you helped implement, and I have to say, it was eye-opening. We've never had discussions like that before. It made us realize how much work still needs to be done, but it also gave us hope that things are changing." Elijah smiled, feeling a sense of pride in the young officers standing before him. "I'm glad to hear that," he said. "The goal of the program isn't just to make people aware, it's to create lasting change, and that starts with conversations like the ones you had." The officers nodded, clearly inspired by what they had learned. "We want to do our part to keep this going," Lieutenant James added. "We've been talking about starting an initiative to mentor younger recruits, especially those from underrepresented backgrounds. We think it could help foster a sense of belonging and support." Elijah's smile widened. This was exactly what he had hoped for, that the next generation of officers would take the lead in continuing the work he had started. "That's an excellent idea," he said. "If you need any support, let me know. I'd be happy to help however I can." The officers thanked him before leaving, and as Elijah watched them walk away, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction. It wasn't just about the policies or the training programs. It was about creating a culture of inclusion where every service member felt valued and respected. And seeing the passion in those young officers gave him hope that the Navy was moving in the right direction. That evening, Elijah sat with Marcia on the porch, enjoying the cool breeze as they sipped tea together. The day had been long, but rewarding, and Elijah felt a sense of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. "Stevens took a plea deal," Elijah told Marcia, breaking the comfortable silence. Marcia raised an eyebrow, looking over at him. "How do you feel about that?" Elijah thought for a moment before answering. "It's not everything I wanted, but it's something. It's a step in the right direction, and it sends a message." Marcia nodded, her expression thoughtful. "It does, and the fact that the Navy is moving forward with the reforms you've been pushing for, that's a victory in itself." Elijah smiled, grateful for her support. "You're right, it's been a long road, but we're getting there." They sat together in silence for a while, the sounds of the evening surrounding them. Elijah's mind wandered to the future, to the continued work that lay ahead. The fight for equality, for justice, was never truly over. There would always be new challenges, new obstacles to overcome. But he felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the changes he had fought for were taking root. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Elijah looked over at Marcia, her face soft in the moonlight. He thought about everything they had been through together, the long nights, the difficult conversations, the endless battle for progress. And through it all, she had been his anchor, his partner, his greatest source of strength. "I couldn't have done any of this without you," Elijah said quietly, his voice filled with gratitude. Marcia smiled, her eyes meeting his. "You've always had the strength, Elijah. I just helped you see it." Elijah reached for her hand, holding it gently as they sat together under the stars. The road ahead was still long, but for the first time in a while, he felt ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, Elijah woke up with a sense of anticipation. The diversity program was set to be fully implemented across all Navy bases, and he had a busy day ahead filled with meetings and strategy sessions. Yet as he prepared for the day, a quiet sense of satisfaction settled over him. The work had been grueling, the pushback at times disheartening, but the fruits of his labor were finally beginning to show. Change, as slow as it could be, was taking root. Elijah arrived at the naval base earlier than usual, his steps filled with purpose as he made his way to his office. As he passed by groups of officers, he caught snippets of conversation about the diversity training. There was a mix of opinions, some praising the program for opening their eyes to issues they hadn't considered, while others were more hesitant, not yet fully on board with the changes. But the important thing, Elijah knew, was that the conversations were happening. That in itself was progress. As the day unfolded, Elijah found himself in a meeting with senior leadership, discussing the next phase of the inclusion initiatives. Admiral Richardson was present, and though their previous conversations had been marked by caution on Richardson's part, today there was a noticeable shift in his demeanor. "Admiral Thompson," Richardson said as the meeting began, "I want to commend you for your leadership on these reforms. The Navy is better for it, and I'm hearing positive feedback from all corners of the fleet." Elijah nodded in acknowledgement, grateful for the support but still mindful of the long road ahead. "Thank you, Admiral. But this is just the beginning. We need to stay vigilant, ensure that these reforms are continually evaluated, and that we hold people accountable for upholding the values we've put in place." Richardson leaned forward, his tone serious. "I couldn't agree more, and that's why I'm considering expanding these initiatives even further. What you've done here is impressive, but there's more work to be done, especially in leadership training. We need to make sure our senior officers are equipped to foster an environment of inclusion and respect." Elijah felt a surge of optimism. This was exactly the kind of commitment he had been pushing for, an expansion that went beyond just the junior ranks and touched every level of the Navy's command structure. "I'm glad to hear that, sir," Elijah said. "If we can get leadership on board, the culture will follow." The rest of the meeting focused on specifics, expanding the mentorship programs, setting up regular evaluations of the inclusion training, and ensuring that there was a clear line of accountability for anyone who violated the principles the Navy was now committed to. By the end of the discussion, Elijah felt confident that real, lasting change was within reach. Later that afternoon, Elijah received a message from Captain Williams, requesting a quick meeting to discuss the mentorship program's next steps. They had been working together on this for months, and Williams had proven to be one of Elijah's strongest allies. As he made his way to her office, Elijah reflected on how far they had come, both as individuals and as leaders in this fight for justice. "Admiral," Williams greeted him warmly as he stepped into her office, "I wanted to show you the latest data from the mentorship program." She handed him a folder filled with reports and feedback from participants. Elijah scanned the documents, nodding as he read the overwhelmingly positive comments from both mentors and mentees. The program had not only helped younger officers feel more supported, but had also created bonds between service members from different backgrounds, bonds that transcended race, rank, and gender. "This is excellent," Elijah said, looking up at Williams. "The feedback shows we're on the right track. We need to keep building on this momentum." Williams smiled, her eyes bright with enthusiasm. "I agree. I've already started drafting plans for the next phase, expanding the mentorship to enlisted personnel as well, not just officers." Elijah's eyes lit up at the suggestion. "That's a great idea. If we can reach every level of the Navy, we'll have a much greater impact." They spent the next hour discussing the logistics of expanding the program, going over potential challenges, and brainstorming ways to address them. By the end of the meeting, Elijah felt energized. This was exactly what he had hoped for when he began this journey, to create something that would outlast him, something that would continue to grow and evolve, improving the lives of everyone in the Navy. That evening, Elijah returned home feeling lighter than he had in a long time. The pieces were finally falling into place. The case against Officer Stevens had been resolved, the diversity training was being implemented, and the mentorship program was expanding. It wasn't perfect, and there was still resistance, but the progress was undeniable. As Elijah sat down for dinner with Marcia, he shared the events of the day with her, recounting the success of the mentorship program and the positive feedback they had received. "I'm so proud of you," Marcia said softly, reaching across the table to take his hand. "You've worked so hard for this, and now it's finally happening." Elijah smiled, feeling the warmth of her words settle over him. "It's been a long road," he admitted, "but I feel like we're making real progress now." "You are," Marcia said, "and it's only going to get better from here. You've laid the foundation for something incredible." Elijah leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. For so long, he had carried the weight of this fight on his shoulders. But now, for the first time, he felt like he wasn't carrying it alone. There were others, like Williams, Hall, and the young officer he had mentored, who were ready to continue the work. As the evening wore on, Elijah and Marcia sat together on the porch, watching the sky fade from deep blue to black. The stars twinkled above them, and for a moment, Elijah allowed himself to simply be, free from the burdens of leadership, from the weight of expectation. "You've done good, Elijah," Marcia said quietly, resting her head on his shoulder. "You've made a real difference." Elijah smiled, the words filling him with a deep sense of satisfaction. He had fought for justice, for equality, for a better Navy, and he had succeeded. But more than that, he had laid the groundwork for others to continue the fight, to build on the progress they had made. And as he looked out at the stars, Elijah knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, he had done everything in his power to make the Navy and the world a better place. As the final weeks of the diversity and inclusion training rolled out, the impact became clear. The Navy had embraced the changes, and while there were still areas where resistance lingered, the overall culture had begun to shift. Elijah had watched as conversations that once seemed impossible were now happening openly. Officers and enlisted personnel were sharing their stories, listening to each other's experiences, and grappling with the biases that had long gone unacknowledged. One morning, Elijah stood in front of a group of newly graduated officers at a ceremony. He had been asked to speak, and as he looked out at the fresh faces before him, he felt the weight of the moment. These young men and women were the future of the Navy, and they were stepping into an institution that was evolving before their very eyes. "Today, you are beginning a journey," Elijah began, his voice steady and strong. "A journey that will test your resolve, challenge your values, and push you to be better. But I want you to remember something as you move forward in your careers. Leadership is about more than rank or title. It's about integrity, and it's about standing up for what's right, even when it's hard." The room was silent as the officers listened intently. "You are part of an institution with a long history," Elijah continued, "but history is not set in stone. It is shaped by the people who step forward to lead. You have the power to shape the future of this Navy, to make it more inclusive, more just, and more reflective of the values we hold dear." As Elijah spoke, he thought about his own journey, the struggles he had faced, and the victories he had won. He thought about the young officers like Marcus Davis, who had the passion and potential to continue the fight for justice. And he thought about the countless men and women who had come before him, who had paved the way for the progress they were now seeing. "Never forget," Elijah said, his voice rising with conviction, "that the strength of this Navy lies in its people. And it is your duty to ensure that every person who serves, no matter their background, feels valued, respected, and empowered to succeed." The ceremony concluded with applause, and as the new officers filed out, many of them stopped to shake Elijah's hand, thanking him for his words. He smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This was what he had fought for, a Navy where conversations about equality were no longer avoided but embraced. Later that afternoon, Elijah received a call from Admiral Richardson. The conversation was brief, but it carried with it the final piece of validation that Elijah had been seeking. "Elijah," Richardson began, his voice warm and congratulatory, "I wanted to personally thank you for everything you've done. The reforms you've championed have been a game changer for this institution. We're seeing real results, and I have no doubt that these changes will leave a lasting legacy." Elijah listened, his heart swelling with pride. He had never been one to seek accolades, but hearing those words from Richardson meant more than he could express. "I appreciate that, Admiral," Elijah replied, "but this has always been a team effort. The Navy is full of leaders who are ready to take this work even further. And they will," Richardson said, "because of the foundation you've laid." When the call ended, Elijah sat back in his chair, reflecting on the journey that had brought him to this point. The fight for justice was never easy, but the victories, small and large, were worth every challenge, every moment of doubt. He had given his all to this institution, and now, as he neared the twilight of his career, he felt confident that he was leaving it in a better place than he had found it. That evening, Elijah and Marcia went out for dinner, celebrating not just his accomplishments, but the journey they had shared. As they sat together, laughing and reminiscing, Elijah felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude for the life they had built. Marcia had been his rock, his partner through it all, and he couldn't imagine having made it this far without her by his side. "You've changed so many lives, Elijah," Marcia said, her voice soft but filled with pride. "Not just in the Navy, but in every person you've mentored, every person you've inspired." Elijah smiled, squeezing her hand gently. "I couldn't have done any of it without you." They spent the rest of the evening talking about the future, about retirement, about traveling, about the life they would build together once Elijah's career in the Navy came to an end. But even as they discussed these new chapters, Elijah knew that his work wasn't truly over. He would always carry with him the lessons he had learned, the values he had fought for, and the legacy he had left behind. As they returned home that night, Elijah stood on the porch, looking up at the stars. The sky was clear, and the air was cool, and for the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. The battles he had fought, the challenges he had faced, they had all led him to this moment. And while there was still work to be done, Elijah knew that the future was bright. He turned to Marcia, who stood beside him, her arm linked through his. Together, they looked out at the world ahead of them, filled with possibility, filled with hope. And as they stood there side by side, Elijah knew that whatever came next, they would face it together.